Good evening. I'm Rachel Bronson, President and CEO of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Welcome to Conversations Before Midnight. It's the Bulletin's annual virtual gathering. It's wonderful, truly wonderful to welcome more than 200 guests from around the world, some on the YouTube stream, some even joining us in the middle of the night. We meet under very difficult circumstances. President Vladimir Putin regularly and recklessly issues nuclear threats, leading President Joe Biden to conclude that the risk of nuclear use is at the highest level since the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. And that President Putin is, quote, not joking when he talks about the use of tactical nuclear weapons or biological or chemical weapons. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres similarly stated that we are facing a time of nuclear danger not seen since the height of the Cold War. And just last week, China's President Xi sent a message that nuclear use is a red line for China, giving Beijing some common ground with Brussels and Washington. The Bulletin has played an important role warning of the growing dangers, documenting them as they unfold, providing a platform on which leading experts can dispel and debunk misinformation, offering policy recommendations for moving forward, and providing a beacon of sober analysis to all of those who want to stay informed about current events. In the days before the invasion, our then social media coordinator, Sarah Starkey, published a YouTube video drawing early attention to President Putin's reckless nuclear rhetoric. That video drew over 5 million views across multiple social media platforms. On the day after the Russian invasion of Ukraine, Bulletin editor Matt Field published an article on the risks of dangerous pathogens being released, an article that nearly 500,000 people have read. Our work has appeared in places such as the New York Times and used to fact check and discredit Russian disinformation campaigns and propaganda. In the 5 weeks following the invasion, 2 million people visited the Bulletin's website, many coming to read the Bulletin Science and Security Board statement condemning Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And just 2 weeks ago, Bulletin editors Francois Diaz-Morin and Thomas Gulkin published a piece that our editor-in-chief, John Mecklin, conceived of as a public service announcement aimed at those who have been casually talking about nuclear war as if one is winnable. In their piece, Nowhere to Hide, Thomas and Francois show how devastating a nuclear exchange would be, even if it is limited to a regional conflict. Over 500,000 visitors viewed that article, making it the most read nuclear article in our recorded history. With the support of our crack digital team, the article is circulating widely to general interest audiences and among experts. The Bulletin continues to serve as the publication of record for the nuclear community. But here's something we know. If we find a way out of the current situation in Ukraine and we're able to reduce the heat around the nuclear threat, the climate will continue to change, artificial intelligence will continue to evolve, mis and disinformation will continue to swirl, and bio-risks will continue to multiply. The Bulletin's mandate to provide the public, scientists, and policymakers with the information needed to reduce man-made threats to our existence will continue to demand ongoing vigilance. In the biospace, the Bulletin recently launched a major new task force focused on creating the framework for tomorrow's pathogen research. Members include 20 globally recognized experts in virology, law, ethics, and epidemiology. We'll publish our findings later this year. The United Nations Office of Disarmament Affairs has included 14 Bulletin articles as recommended reading in advance of the 9th Review Conference of the Bioweapons Convention in Geneva later this month, more than any other think tank, government agency, or publication. Bulletin articles have been cited in readouts for meetings held on the Biodefense Posture Review, meetings attended by US Defense Department officials at the highest levels. In response to fast-changing events, my team works around the clock, producing first-class analysis. We are building our capacity, adding editors, experimenting with videos, and trying out new social media platforms. We are a small operation of 17 full-time staff, but up from 8 just a few years ago. We have created an editorial fellows program and a board fellows program to continue our outreach and mentorship of rising experts at the early stages of their careers who come from diverse backgrounds. This complements our Reeser Award, the capstone of the Bulletin's Next Generation program, created to ensure that new voices steeped in science and public policy have a trusted platform from which to address humanity's greatest challenges. Your support allows us to meet today's overwhelming challenges and play a meaningful role at a moment when the public square of ideas is under attack. At the end of 2022, we will have welcomed about 6 million people onto our website, nearly half of whom are younger than 35, and nearly half of whom come from outside the United States. We are so grateful. As we get started with our program tonight, I want to remind everyone that the world of virtual events can be bumpy. If you have any issue tonight, please email us at help@thebulletin.org, and a member of my team will get back to you quickly. While you're in the main session, you'll be on mute, but feel free to use the chat as you've seen others are doing as you see people in the gallery. When we move to the small dedicated group conversations, make sure to unmute yourself and turn on your cameras to join the conversation. And if you get disconnected or lost at any point, you can rejoin the event from your original link. We have an extraordinary group of experts with us tonight. Thank you to all of them for helping support the Bulletin's work and for leading what I know will be terrific conversations. A special shout out to our Science and Security Board members, special guests, speakers Emma Belcher, Ilya Ponomarenko, the Reeser Award recipient Noah Mayhew, all of whom you'll hear from tonight. And a special shout out to Lotus Blue for serving as our lead sponsor and all others who contributed to make this evening possible. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce our keynote conversation between Emma Belcher and John Mecklin. Dr. Belcher is the president of the Ploughshares Fund, a global security foundation dedicated to reducing the threat of nuclear weapons. Prior to Ploughshares, Emma spent nearly a decade at the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, where she led the foundation's Nuclear Challenges grant-making program. A PhD from Tufts University, Dr. Belcher started her career as an advisor in Australia's Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet on National Security and International Affairs. John Mecklin is the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. He oversees a growing team of editors that publish on a daily basis while continuing to produce our bi-monthly magazine found in nearly 10,000 libraries around the world. Previous to his work with the Bulletin, John was editor-in-chief of Miller McCune, subsequently renamed Pacific Standard, an award-winning national magazine that focused on research-based solutions to major policy problems. John, over to you.
Thanks a lot, Rachel. I appreciate it. And this is really exciting for me to get a chance to talk to Emma in front of all our friends that I've seen joining us here tonight. I think I'll jump right into the question of the hour, the day. Vladimir Putin and a string of other Russian officials have been making nuclear threats on a regular basis for months now. The question really is, how real are those threats? I mean, is there a real likelihood that Russia would use a tactical nuclear weapon or more than one?
Well, thanks, John. First, let me just thank the Bulletin for inviting me here as a guest. I'm really delighted and honoured to be doing so and to be doing so with John Mecklin. And it's really lovely to see friends and colleagues and others from all around the world. So thanks very much. Great to see you. So, John, you asked about how real this threat is that Putin might use nuclear weapons and how might we tell? Well, we have to take this threat very seriously. But there's no way really to tell if he's going to use them because we just can't get into his mind. What we do know, though, is he's effectively used his nuclear weapons already without even detonating them. And just by threatening to use nuclear weapons, he's been able to invade a sovereign country. And this has resulted in war crimes, humanitarian crisis, and impacts on the global economy. And this really brings up a very important issue that I'm sure will be a theme throughout tonight, which is our reliance on nuclear deterrence. We see here how nuclear deterrence has been at play during this war. On the one hand, Russia's nuclear deterrent has forced limited support from the US and NATO to defend Ukraine because they want to avoid a direct confrontation between major nuclear powers. But on the other hand, presumably Putin has been deterred himself from expanding the war further and attacking NATO countries out of fear of retaliation and escalation. But either way, nuclear weapons haven't exactly kept the peace, and they've done little for the people of Ukraine. So what we're seeing now in very real terms is that the nuclear threat is very dangerous and we've ignored it too long. And the sort of status quo that we've been accepting is undermining our security and, quite frankly, sense of humanity. So it's really incumbent upon us to act now.
Yeah, and it's not just a vague threat or an idle threat. It's a real possibility. And I know you've thought about, we at the Bulletin have thought about, well, if that happens, if Russia were to use a tactical nuclear weapon, however they might, in Ukraine, what would the response of your organization be? And you talk to a lot of people in a community of organizations concerned with nuclear affairs. What has been talked about within that community in recent months?
Yes, well, as you point out, it's certainly been a busy time for those of us in the community. And I think the discussions, we've had many discussions, and of course, what happens if he detonates a weapon depends on where he does that, what the size is, what the targets are. But, we could see a case where there would be civilian casualties, potentially famine, disruption of the global economy, and environmental effects, depending on the scale. So I think one thing to be clear on is that this would be devastating, and we probably actually don't have a really good picture right now of just, the full extent and range. But I think the consensus really, at least in the non-proliferation and disarmament community that I've been involved in discussions with, is that if Putin did use a nuclear weapon, that the US should not use a nuclear weapon in response. This would be catastrophic. It could escalate to nuclear war, and it would be unnecessary. So rather, the approach would be certainly diplomatic and trying all the range of tools like sanctions. We'd need to get China and India on board. And I think if Putin were to use a nuclear weapon, then they would likely be on board as well, to sanction Russia and isolate it in a way that it just hasn't been yet. There also, of course, are conventional responses, and we'd need to keep in mind what level of response would trigger other levels of potential escalation. So that would be something to look at very closely. But I think when we step back and think about this, we'd need to think, what is this framework we can work under going forward? Now that Putin had gone there and used a nuclear weapon, how can we deal with him in Russia? And what are the implications for nuclear policy? So what we do then will be consequential for years to come. And if I might just reflect quickly, John, on something on a more personal note, for the first time in my career, and I think for many others, people on this call and others, all of a sudden this threat has gone from something that is a little bit more abstract, kind of theoretical, something we talk about a lot, we worry about, to something that is very real. We've had conversations in the community about what do we do if Putin uses a nuclear weapon next week? And that kind of planning really brings it home. And I think we're a small community. We're in high demand to react quickly to these developments. And it's a community that's been stretched thin for a long time. And this is really hard work. But one thing that really gives me hope is this is such a dedicated field. Ploughshares and our partners, including the Bulletin, are working together really well and are rising to meet the moment.
Yes, and I mean, it's certainly at the Bulletin, we've talked about, well, what do we do if a nuclear weapon happens, but it's set off. But even if it isn't, the threats have had an effect around the world. There are other trouble areas in the world, that other countries that have gone nuclear, want to go nuclear, Iran, North Korea, and the Ukraine situation has had ramifications for dealing with those countries. I was wondering if you can talk a little bit about what have these nuclear threats done to arms control and just the nuclear landscape generally.
Yeah, well, it's great that you've raised that, because I think just because Ukraine dominates the headlines doesn't mean that there aren't other nuclear crises around the world that are being impacted, quite frankly, as you point out, by what's happening now. And, you know, and if we look at, say, a country like Iran, so we've got talks on the Iran nuclear deal have really been put on hold. They seem to get quite close at a certain point. They were imminent, and then we've moved away from that. And I think, you know, obviously it's on hold because of the protests right now, and also concerning activity out of Iran in supplying Russia with drones. So I think this is all creating quite a challenging situation as we think, how can we deal with Iran, prevent it from acquiring nuclear weapons, but at this particularly difficult time where the prospect of a deal really isn't in sight. So that's a particular challenge. And I think while we certainly haven't seen indication as of yet that Iran has decided to acquire a nuclear weapon, the very real threat that potentially one day it might do so is there. And you mentioned other countries like North Korea. So North Korea has scaled up its missile testing, including launching a test recently over Japan for the first time in a while. And a nuclear test, an actual test of its nuclear weapon, might be imminent again for the first time in a number of years. Now, what's concerning is that potentially Putin's sort of threat to use nuclear weapons, or his use of nuclear weapons in that respect, might be showing North Korea how important nuclear weapons are to its security, and potentially make it less likely to want to agree to give them up in the future. So that's really another implication. And then finally, I'd probably say on China, we know that we're seeing China is ramping up and modernizing its nuclear arsenal, concerns about how do we engage with China in arms control when it doesn't yet want to do that with the United States or Russia. But we also know that while the China-Taiwan situation isn't at all the same as the Russia-Ukraine situation, we know that China is watching to see what kind of response the community is providing to Putin with his threat to use nuclear weapons. So clearly very consequential there.
Yes, it's almost like the Chinese might be taking notes on what's going on in Ukraine, which is a scary thought. The ramifications also reach the United States. There's been political conflict, let's just put it bluntly, you know, Republicans and Democrats, and a lot of talk about maybe Republicans would be less likely to support Ukraine, or there would be some change, you know, in how we dealt with that situation if Republicans came to power. Now, the results of yesterday's elections are kind of unclear right now, although it looks like Republicans may well take at least one of the chambers of Congress. What do you make of that? What do you make of the Republican talk about being less in Ukraine's corner?
Right. Yeah, I mean, obviously, we're all waiting to see the results of the election, and we don't have definitive outcome in a few key races. But I think regardless of the outcome, and even with a Republican majority, we do expect aid to Ukraine to continue, but maybe in a lesser amount or in a different way. Probably much more debate about the support for Ukraine. I think what we should be looking for and watching for is changes in rhetoric. With a Republican majority, there will be a more hawkish stance, more hawkish language toward China and North Korea. But I think fundamentally, when it comes to the topic of nuclear weapons, unfortunately, both parties are really deeply entrenched in the status quo. We see the defence budget continuing on an upwards trend, and I think it's unlikely we're going to see anything different in the near future. So that's unfortunate news, but I think it's probably reality.
You know, it certainly seems that way to me. We do have a limited time here, so I'm going to ask you one last question, but it's an interesting one. I lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. I remember my parents telling me, if you hear anything strange at school today, run home, right? So that is real, visceral nuclear fear. But I've had people call me, stop me on the street, say, are we really going to have a nuclear war? What do you think? What are the parallels between the Cuban Missile Crisis and today? And how are they the same? How are they different?
Well, I think maybe rather than parallels, there are lessons that we could draw from the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I think the big lesson is, yes, deterrence is a dangerous gamble. We got lucky in 1962, and we've been lucky, numerous times since then. But as any gambler knows, at a certain point, your luck runs out. And I think it's really key here that we don't confuse good luck with good leadership. And after the Cuban Missile Crisis, the US and Russia and the international community really worked together to reduce nuclear tensions. And we need to get back to that kind of approach at the appropriate time, right? So we need to seize the moment when it's right in this spirit of working together to reduce tensions. And I think there are several immediate questions for our communities, such as how do we support Ukraine while not escalating to nuclear use, and seek an end to the conflict on favourable terms to Ukraine that doesn't also reward Putin's blackmail. And so from all of this, I think what we need to take away is that we've got to do some really long-term serious thinking about how do we get out of this status quo of nuclear deterrence that we're in and replace it with something better once and for all.
That's a wonderful, hopeful note to end this keynote on. I really thank you for showing up for our audience of friends who come to hear exactly the sort of deep analysis that you've given. At this point, I'm going to hand things off to Dave Kuhlman, our chairman of our governing board. And thanks again, Emma.
Thanks, John. It was my pleasure.
Emma and John, thank you. What a wonderful and informative way to start the evening. Good evening. I'm Dave Kuhlman, Senior Partner and Chair at Lotus Blue Consulting, and I am privileged to serve as Chair of the Governing Board of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Thank you all for attending tonight and for joining me in supporting this extraordinary organization. I'd also like to thank Carnegie Corporation of New York, the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation, Holt House Trust, the Ploughshares Fund, and the many institutional and private foundations for their ongoing annual support of the Bulletin, along with the many individuals who make gifts large and small throughout the year. And many thanks to tonight's gold and silver sponsors who helped make this gathering possible. My firm, Lotus Blue Consulting, is delighted to be a lead corporate sponsor of tonight's event. We partner with the Bulletin throughout the year, supporting initiatives such as the Editorial Fellows Program, assisting in strategic planning to ensure the organization remains robust, and hosting small corporate events featuring Bulletin experts. I've been involved with the Bulletin for about 5 years now. The organization in that time has more than doubled its audience and now has over 5 million unique visitors coming to the site annually. Simply put, I'm involved because the Bulletin exists to inform and equip people like you and me to do our part in securing our future. It operates with an explicit belief that armed with expertise, facts, and goodwill, we can make our world a safer place. The Bulletin provides the information and analysis and perspectives that enable us to think for ourselves rather than fear-mongering or pushing a single perspective. It honors our intelligence, thoughtfulness, and independent thinking, both as individuals and within our communities. We know this because time and time again, people turn to the Bulletin in a crisis. The Bulletin received record-breaking traffic from visitors around the world during the early days of COVID, as audience sought fact-based answers to some of their most pressing questions. We welcomed over 2 million visitors in the weeks following Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Over the last few months, as the situation unfortunately has gotten even more tense, the traffic has again spiked. I think we all know these crises will continue to happen, though we don't yet know what form they'll take. But when they do, the Bulletin will be there to provide the knowledge we need to engage and be actors in our own future, not passive observers to be pandered to. The world needs the Bulletin, and we need your help to ensure it remains strong and influential. I am pleased to share that a Bulletin supporter has generously offered a $10,000 matching gift challenge. That means by donating tonight, you can double your impact in meeting this challenge. All gifts will be matched 1-to-1 up to $10,000. So please consider making a gift to our annual fund, or a gift in honor or memory of a mentor, family member, or special person in your life. Your gift can be directed to support the Bulletin's Next Generation program, editorial content support, public programs, or our Doomsday Clock activities. Or you can allow Bulletin leadership to put that money where it matters most. Your gifts make a difference, large or small. The Bulletin raises 85% of its funding each year, and a significant portion of that comes from tonight's event. With your support, the Bulletin continues to deliver quality journalism through its website, newsletter, online magazine, and public programs. I ask you to join me in making a gift to the Bulletin tonight. I hope you will consider giving generously. This small but mighty organization, started by Einstein and Oppenheimer 75 years ago, still keeps making a difference in the world. So let's keep investing in the places that matter. You have several ways to make a gift. Your first option is to text Bulletin to 41444. That's texting the word Bulletin to 41444. And you'll get a link to the secure portal sent to your phone. Secondly, you can go to the bulletin.org/match and use the secure portal. And third, we always welcome paper checks. Now, I want to introduce the Bulletin's 2021 Reeser Award winner, Noah Mayhew. Noah's essay, A Millennial's View, ICBMs Are Ridiculous, was selected by the Bulletin's editorial team from its Voices of Tomorrow feature that promotes rising experts who write with distinction on topics including nuclear risk, climate change, and disruptive technologies. The Reeser Award is named for physicist Leonard M. Reeser, board chair at the Bulletin from 1984 to 1998. Noah, I'd like to ask you to join the virtual stage and share a few words.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Dear colleagues, I would like to thank you for joining us this evening, and also I would like to thank the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists for the great honor of awarding me the Leonard M. Reeser Award. As you've heard, I was granted the award for my article at the Bulletin entitled A Millennial's View, ICBMs Are Ridiculous. Now, the idea that ICBMs are the most dangerous leg of the nuclear triad is in fact not new, having been voiced before by preeminent experts in the field. They are inherently dangerous owing to their use it or lose it nature in a crisis. They are redundant considering that either of the other legs of the nuclear triad could inflict unacceptable damage to an opponent in a second strike scenario, and they are ludicrously expensive to maintain and upgrade. Now, as a younger expert in the field, the cost of these weapons strikes a particular chord with me. If one looks at the exorbitant cost of education or healthcare in the United States, or at the amount of money that should be going into mitigating the effects of climate change, it becomes impossible to many young experts to justify why we spend so much money on these inherently destabilizing and redundant weapons. Even within the non-proliferation space, there are so many other good uses for that money, potentially. For example, making further contributions to the International Atomic Energy Agency's Safeguards mission, which in 2020 operated on a budget of 148.7 million euros. For perspective, the New York Police Department's budget for that same year was 8.9 billion euros. While these are the reasons I wrote the article, I must point out that it was published in July 2021. In February 2022, the Russian Federation initiated war against Ukraine. Since this war began, I have recalled the words of one of my colleagues at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Nonproliferation, Dr. Nikolai Sokov. In 2020, Nikolai said that we had forgotten how to fear nuclear war. Now, I pray that the thinly veiled threats by Russia on the potential use of nuclear weapons would remind us all of that fear and how easy it would be to blunder into a nuclear exchange. Finally, I wish to say that I didn't write the article because I'm a young expert per se. I wrote the article because it is my generation who has inherited this world from the trailblazers who have kept us safe up until this point. And to them, I am grateful. As with the previous generation, we have the opportunity to remember how to fear nuclear war and take action to ensure that it never comes to pass. And that starts with diplomacy. I recall here the words of US President John F. Kennedy in 1963. He said, "Let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot now end our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's future. And we are all mortal." In closing, ladies and gentlemen, I wish you a very good evening. I thank you again for the honor of this award, and I wish peaceful skies above your heads. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Noah. It is now time for us to transition to the small group conversations, really a highlight of the evening. When we do, turn on your cameras, take yourself off mute, and turn on gallery view to see all of your virtual table mates. As we transition, please enjoy our short 3-minute video about Amnesia Atomica, a 3-story inflatable mushroom cloud created by Mexican artist Pedro Reyes that we installed in Times Square for a week in May. After the video, you'll be moved virtually to your table conversations. If that doesn't happen, or you end up in the wrong room, please email us at help@thebulletin.org. We'll get it all sorted out. To the folks on YouTube, we'll say goodbye to you now. Thank you for joining. And for all of you in the Zoom room, enjoy the video.
That kind of iconic power that Times Square has was the perfect context to introduce this message.
The Bulletin is here in Times Square for a week from May 17th to 24th. We're hosting Amnesia Atomica, which is a series of programs and events centered around Pedro Reyes's Zero Nukes 30-foot mushroom cloud. We're putting a number of experts down under this mushroom cloud that Pedro Reyes created to answer questions and provide different ways for people to get engaged, whether it's through the arts, whether it's through reading the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, whether it's for signing petitions that are going to their policymakers. All of that's going to be down under the cloud on Thursday and Friday.
The invasion of Ukraine has shown the whole world what the realities are around nuclear weapons. That we are all held hostages to the whims of a few men. One sudden lapse of judgment or unpredictable decision of one of these leaders could lead us all into a massive global catastrophe.
Nuclear weapons do not target military installations, but set entire cities on fire. And there can be no adequate response to a city on fire.
I suggested, why don't we develop a public artwork? We worked with the artist Pedro Reyes to reinsert the narrative of nuclear threat into the public dialogue.
I started working with the idea of the mushroom cloud. What was missing was a slogan, a very clear rejection of nuclear weapons. I arrived to Zero Nukes because the zero is a concept that is common to all languages, translated into the 8 languages of the countries that have nuclear weapons.
What I love about the piece is that simultaneously it's dealing with our past, but also demonstrating a very clear step forward.
I think that artists like Pedro, and Pedro in particular, take these incredibly big, overwhelming, and complex ideas, synthesize them in a way that is easier to understand and take in.
New York is the right place to have this conversation. This is the crossroads, and there's tourists from all over the world passing by, and they're seeing this message in all different languages, and it affects all of them. It affects all of us.
We have to be hopeful and trust that cultural change can happen faster than we want to believe. It's in our hands to change this issue.